Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Norwegian Institute, both in person and online. We are very happy tonight to welcome a bunch of Norwegian students at NIA. I guess most of you first time, both from the University of Oslo, Professor Anastasia Maravella accompanying them. Thank you so much. And from the University of Bergen, from the School or Faculty, or please correct me, of European Studies, the Department of European Studies.
Department of Comparable Politics.
Great, thank you so much. It's our pleasure to welcome also our speaker for tonight, Dr. Thomas Alexander Husøy, who studied at Swansea University in the UK, where he obtained his BA, Master and PhD. In 2020, Thomas received a travel grant from the Norwegian Institute at Athens to complete his thesis, which is very much related to what NIA is all about, or has been all about, Arcadia the Year. Maybe some of you know that the Norwegian Institute was established because of the excavations of Norwegian scholars from the University of Bergen in the beginning, Professor Erik Osby in the year. So Thomas was studying this area, and for that reason, we were very happy to give him the grant. This grant assisted in the completion of his thesis titled From Phokis to Aetolia, Ethnicity and Federalism in Greek Antiquity, where he investigated links between ethnicity and federalism from the Archaic to the Hellenistic period of Greek history in the regions of Phokis, Boeotia, Arcadia, and Aetolia. Thomas is also senior editor and peer review coordinator for the journal New Classicists, an online journal for early career and postgraduate scholars focusing on the ancient world, while he's also working as a outreach officer and historian at the Norwegian Church in Cardiff, Norwegian Church Art Center in Cardiff Bay, the city of Cardiff, where he's doing very interesting things. He's focusing on disseminating historical knowledge about the seamen, Norwegian seamen mission, which means the connection between the western part of Norway, Bergen, for example, and most importantly, and the eastern part of the UK, the seafaring relations that those countries, and it's a story pretty underexplored. So this knowledge will be extremely interesting for the two countries. And he's also responsible for a new digital museum project, which is starting now, about the first Norwegian church outside Norway in Edinburgh. So you see, this is a kind of international relations also that Thomas is involved in. Regarding his continuing research in identity and regionalism in ancient Greece, Thomas has published several chapters in collective volumes, and in 2022 has co-edited the collective volume Narratives of Power in the Ancient World, together with Dr. Erska Furlan and Henry Bohan as co-editors. Last but not least, Thomas has come back to the Institute to get involved into a fairly small scale EEA grants funded digital heritage project. We have also attached a handout for this event, which is on Thursday, and it's about documenting local heritage from Arcadia the year to Wikipedia. So Thomas has been a main contributor to that project, but for that we will discuss it on Thursday. For now, I give him the floor to deliver the lecture titled Using the Myths of the Past to Forge Regional Identity in the Ancient Present. Thank you so much for being with us. Enjoy.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And also, I'd like to say thank you to Delia and Pascales for the kind invitation to come and speak about my doctoral research here, which, as already said, focused on regionalism and identity in the ancient Greek world, focusing on specific regions. If I could, I would put all of the regions I studied into this talk, but I'd presumably be here for a couple of weeks. And people probably eventually throw me over the balcony because they get tired of it. But yeah, so in today's lecture, I will be looking into some of the case studies from my thesis, as well as some increasing interest I have in looking into uses of the past and historical consciousness as approaches to ancient Greece and identity formation as well. And I will primarily focus on the two regions of Boeotia in central Greece and the Peloponnese and Arcadia in the Peloponnese. I will also, because we are from the Region Institute, include a little bit at the end about a similar sort of things in Tegea, because if we're going to present anything here, that's just appropriate, I think. And as Delia said, Tegea was an important part of my doctoral thesis, which I finished just over a year ago now. But before entering those discussions, I will be discussing some of the methodological concepts I'll be applying, and that should be kept in mind throughout this talk. Now, first say that I chose Boeotia and Arcadia out of the four regions that my thesis mainly focused on, because these are two that has very fascinating mythical stories, and they're sort of very different from each other, because in Boeotia you have a tale of how they come into the region through migration from Thessaly, whilst in Arcadia there's a claim of being autochthonous. Their first ancestors literally sprung from the earth in their idea of their origin. So two quite different regions, and whilst I won't be touching much on it here, there's still two regions that has surprisingly many things in common in terms of place names and things like that. So there is a link there at some point, which is for another study one day. And I'll be looking into how myths, in particular myths of the past, are used to form these identity groups. Just say one very famous example that was highlighted by Thomas Nilsson, just to see, so you know sort of what sort of thing I'm talking about. In the 4th century, there was a region on the west coast of the Peloponnese that all of a sudden had an eponymous hero called Tryphilus, literally in the region of Tryphilia, literally the region of the three peoples. And there's no record of this hero before that time. So it gets invented at that point, becomes a descendant of Alcas, the eponym of Arcadia, which I will talk about later. And through that, they become Arcadian as well. So it's a very fascinating sort of illustration of how myth can be used and recreated to, or even in this case, completely constructed, to create a layer of identity in the ancient present. They're always worth mentioning because they are quite a famous example when I do talks about this. Now, let's go over to the focus for the talk, which I've already gone through. But yeah, my focus will be particularly on the use of specific mythical stories and how they use to form a group's conception of themselves, or what Hans-Joachim Goerke calls intentional history. So such stories, they were a very important part of identity groups in ancient Greece, and stories constantly reshaped to fit into new settings. And it's not always chronological developments that fits when the stories are redeveloped. And you have stories that doesn't really match up, you can't really line them up, but that isn't necessarily a requirement for this to make sense in the ancient Greek world. Which is also what makes them a very fascinating part of studying how they perceive the past, since two regions could have completely different chronological narratives of it. But such myths, they are by the very nature set in the past, but their association to specific physical locations in the present, physical locations and places can be seen as a representation of the narratives within the present when they're told. So that's a way of anchoring them for that identity group. And because of that, the feature as a very important part of the identity for groups as well as individuals, making them a crucial part of the study of ancient Greeks' historical consciousness of the ancient Greeks. Also just say that the narratives we have a lot of it is fragmentary. We have some mythography, but there's also an unknown amount of other myths that would have existed at the same time. So we only really have a fraction of all the myths and stories that would have been around, and as a part of this sort of changing concepts of ideas of the past for the ancient Greeks, which makes them even more fascinating to me, the fact that I know there will be so many more, and every time we find a new inscription or a new papyrus or something that talks of Greek genealogies or Greek myths, can be possible to start getting a bigger piece of this massive picture that was ancient Greek myth. And this is particularly true for the myths that I'm studying outside Attica. There's even less of them. And a lot of the ones we have survives through the lens of Athenians rather than from local perspectives. So it's sort of trying to untangle that as well, of the what Athenians wrote down and why they wrote it down and how that would have fitted in with the local varieties in, for instance, Thebes or Commodus or Tegea. So very fascinating thing. But as I was working throughout my doctoral thesis, and working on things such as intentional history and the putative history needed to form identity groups, I eventually came across the Scandinavian research field of historiebruk, or uses of the past, which I started applying into my research, particularly after I found an article in a Scandinavian language journal for the ancient world, where there was a scholar called Jens Krasilikov who wrote an article about historiebruk in gresk or romersk religion, so how the history was used within Greek and Roman religion, and to construct new temples and so on. So at that point, I started sitting there thinking like, what if I started applying this to all my political stuff and all my identity formation stuff, and found it very fascinating. And one day, I hope to be able to find the funding to do a postdoc on it. One day. So I will not sort of outline too much of what I mean with historiebruk, but since there's a lot of Norwegian students there, I presume you already know. But I have primarily sort of based myself on the typology that is set by Claes-Göran Karlsson. And these are sort of the main three that I'll be focusing on today, which is sort of the existential one that pertains to form of history use that's applied specifically to anchor identities in many cases, and is commonly used by individuals and groups alike. And Karlsson says that, well, everyone uses that type, so must be popular. Then political, or he calls it political pedagogical, but I call it just political for now, which is used by political elites to legitimize and rationalize arguments and positions, as well as the ideological, which is often historic arguments used by elites to illustrate or debate in order to politicize and for their argumentation, that can be used to, if you argue well enough, you can use that to create new layers of identity as well. And with that, normally I ramble on about methodology for about half an hour, but I will spare you that today. I jump into my case studies. Now, you're just going to have to imagine with me that this green bit here is a giant lake that is no longer there. This is the S3 base map from QGIS, but in antiquity, there was a big lake there, which is kind of important for one of the myths I'll be talking about, actually. So that's, yeah. And I'll be jumping into Boeotia, which, as you see on this map, is just to the west of Attica, sort of roughly on the plain here, in the hills there, and is by far the largest chapter of my thesis, because that is the one of these regions I studied where we have the most evidence, again, because they're so near Attica. There's a lot of Boeotian influences in Attic place for that reason. And it's a region that has a particularly complex myth history. If you read the Pausanias entry on it, there's a lot of different groups, a lot of different names. So I had to calm myself down and limit it to some discussions. And I'm going to do that with the migration myth that I already mentioned, as well as the myth of Erginus and Heracles, which is one that I find particularly interesting. And this one is actually partly based on an article in the volume I added it. So that's also good. And also, of course, I decided to include Arcadia. I can't be standing here talking about Boeotia all night, so I just get through this bit and then get to the fun bit, which includes the gear. Now, according to Thucydides, the Boeotian migration took place following their expulsion from Thessaly sorry, wrong way. They are the opposite way, was what I was told. There. Migration from the region of Thessaly, which is up here. They allegedly migrate sort of from the south there, but the city they were thought to have migrated from isn't found. There's some who speculates that it wasn't really a city that existed. It's more of a construct. But in the south of Thessaly here, somewhere, would the city of Arne have been located in the Boeotian historical consciousness? It should also be mentioned that Thucydides, even though he said this happened shortly after Trojan War, roughly about 60 years, he does also acknowledge that there would have been Boeotians in Boeotia before that, largely because the catalogue of ships mention it, and if Homer mentioned it, you can't really say they didn't exist there at that point, even though the Catholic ships, well, probably a 6th century text. So in terms of that, that was established tradition, so he has sort of a double layer of migration bits going on in his account of it. Now, this migration from the city of Arne is quite significant in terms of uses of the past within the region of Boeotia, as according to the traditions they have themselves, the first city they founded in Boeotia itself was also named Arne.
Yeah, c'est bon. Yeah.
On va partir.
On va partir maintenant. Tu as bien fait la gymnastique.
On est où?
On est là.
Là?
Oui, oui, on est là.
Et après,
Après, là.
Okay. Right. So, recap. Migrated from a alleged city up here called Arne to Boeotia, founded a new city called Arne, so it's kind of a connection there already, but even more so in the fact that the regional eponymous hero, which is called Boetus, who was also a son of a heroine called Arne, who's a daughter of Aeolus. Aeolians, a group that is also often associated with Thessaly. It's debated when that association began, but for me, it's the name Arne that's more important here right now than the name Aeolus. So that shows then a form of history use that they sort of decide to rename that city after the regional eponym's mother, as well as the first location in Thessaly. So it becomes a link there. Now, there are different places in Boeotia who does claim to be Arne. Amongst them is Caronea and Acrafia. And there's Strabo even mentioned that there might have been a city lost under the Lake of Pies, the lake that I swear was there. However, we don't know where the city actually was, if it was an actual city in Boeotia at the time, or whether that's also a literary construct for sure. But there's that history use there that's really interesting to me. And that became even more intriguing when I found an article by Kalliuntzis and Papasarkadas about the Tritopatres in Boeotia, which is a specific cult that had a cultic group attached to them called the Arniaes. So that's yet another sort of play on that name that's happening here. So there's a lot of naming after this, possibly not, may have been real city. To them, it was real, and that's what's important. That's why they name things after it, and becomes an integral part of identity within this region. So it shows kind of a ideological but also existential use of the past within Boeotia that reflects on these migratory links to Thessaly that they claim to have. I'm not necessarily a follower of all the Greek migrations happening quite as the story says, but I do think small groups of people with moved stories settle, and that's largely how we get these great narratives of migrations, such as, more famously than the Boeotian one, is of course the Dorian migration. But then in the 4th century, we have a very interesting part of this, which comes from Ephorus, who adds to the entire migration narrative that the Boeotians were actually in Boeotia first, expelled to Thessaly, and then returned. So that's an interesting twist on the whole thing. And again, it could be very easily this sort of the high day of Theban and Boeotian power. So it might just be a claim to having actually been a autochthonous group for this region as well, and constructing that one, making them a group that is in their homeland. This is the native land at the time of the height of the power. Sadly, even Norwegian hegemony didn't last very long, but that decade is a place where this could have been reshaped into this. Now, the most interesting thing, sort of that is quite often picked up on early myth history in Boeotia is in the Homeric catalogue ships that is debated when it was written. I tend to work with the 6th century date. It's generally acknowledged that it's sort of been altered since the Iliad was actually written. So I work with a 6th century date for it. And it's within that the Boeotian region is actually split into 2 separate regions. One, Manian region, which, let's see, would have been up in this part here on the northern shore of the lake that was here, and a Boeotian region further down here. The catalog only mentions 2 communities as Manian, but chances are that there was actually more if you look at the geographical distribution of the Boeotian cities, that there's a whole big chunk of the region that isn't actually included, so it's possible that they were also a part of that wider Manian territory. That would be Ocomenus and Aspledon. That is the 2 that I mentioned. Right. Now, the interesting thing here is that at some point in the 6th century, the region is separated into 2, but by the end of it, it has become a confederal, sort of semi-confederal system where a lot of the cities are bound together, which lasts up until about the Persian Wars. Exactly when they came together is hard to say, but at some point towards the end of the 6th century, early 5th century, the Boeotians have come together into one grouping, which included both Ocomenus and Thebes as the main rivals in the region. Now, the unification of this regional group is reflected in a mythical story that's related to the sanctuary of Poseidon at Onchestos, a regional center for the ethnic group. And the story is related to a conflict between the 2 leading cities, Thebes and Ocomenus, and mythical heroes associated with them. In Boeotia, that would be Heracles for Thebes. In Boeotia, Heracles is always Theban. He is always associated with Thebes, whilst in Ocomenus, the hero would be the Manian king Erginus, which has the same name as one of the Argonauts, and sometimes the 2 are conflated. But this is a different mythical story through that altogether that is very fascinating. The main sort of development of the story it's sort of there's a Ocomenian king who dies whilst competing at the games that happens at Onchestos. Because of that, Erginus is killed by a Theban. So Erginus then take revenge on this by sacking Thebes and putting the city under the control of Ocomenus, forcing them to pay tribute. This only works until Heracles comes around. And he goes over to Ocomenus, defeats Ocomenus, drains and stops the power by stopping a very complex drainage system that was in the western part of the region. So he strips their economical power, and then the story differs from there. In one version, Erginus survives. He goes on to father 2 children, Trophonius and Agamedes. And in this version, he also rebuilds the financial position of Ocomenus. So it's a very interesting take on it. Then there's one where Heracles kills Erginus, because Heracles. And then there's a third version, which appears in a fragment by Pherecydes of Athens, where Erginus later is in conflict with the Thebans again during the reign of Oedipus. He kills one of Oedipus' sons. But in that book, clearly, Ocomenus was not fully defeated because they could come back like that. Now, the overarching theme, despite all the violence in that, is the unification of Boeotia into one region with a very strong Theban presence. From this point onwards, Thebes becomes the leading city within the region. I like to think the smaller city does play a bigger role than what is often portrayed when you look into Boeotian history. But you can also ignore the fact that from this point onward, Thebes they are the big guy. They're being challenged from time to time by others, but they are there. Now, but these three versions of the story endings, as I mentioned, they do also represent various versions of history use. So the first one, where Urgenus survives and can live on to father his children, that would be a version where that's probably the earliest version, and one that sort of build around a still relatively stable power balance within the region, even if Thebes is the bigger one. The version where Urgenus is killed is more likely, as has been highlighted by Husøy-Ciaccia as well, to represent a 4th century narrative, possibly after 364, when Ocomenus was brave enough to try to lead a coup within the Norwegian Federation at the time, and with that they failed massively. To say it is what the sources are saying. According to the sources, the city was burned to the ground, was taken down, and so that represents a complete defeat of Ocomenus. So that's probably a 4th century development. Whilst the version where Urgenus lives on to be able to challenge Oedipus is probably, and I follow Robert Buck on that argument, a Ochaemenian version to portray themselves as having come out of it potentially better than they actually did. So there are 3 different versions of histories, and you also see that local dynamic happening where Ocomenus can have their own version of the story. The main slightly annoying thing with these is that, as with so many other Greek myths, they survive in very, very late accounts. So you just have to try to trace them back with the political developments, because the main accounts for this is Pseudo-Apollodorus, Diodorus, and Pausanias, which are all much later sources, of course, than what we're talking about here. And there we have it. Yeah. And with that, I will also now jump over to Arcadia, and where the Institute is much more interested than Greece, which is the central mountains of this peninsula here. They're very beautiful mountains. If you have a chance, I recommend at some point to have a look down there. Now, they're a very interesting region in many cases. They have a strong local regional identity, which is the Arcadians. And as Knut Ødegaard mentioned in his recent talk, it might be a very, very well beyond old, very, very old identity, one of the Greek regional identities that are actually old. But this is where the story I mentioned to begin with Tryphilus being invented comes in, because the concept of who is Arcadian is a constantly changing thing. And I'm currently working on an article where I try to argue for 3 separate groups within this region, and it's part of what I'm going to come in to talk a little bit about now, because that's the Paratians, Sasanians, and Eastern Arcadians. Now, but just a sort of an example of how history use and things changes a lot within here. In the south of part of this region, I think the mountain down here, you have Mount Lycaeum, which is traditionally seen as a quintessential important Arcadian sanctuary, but possibly not before the classical period. Before that, it's more likely to have been a Paratian sanctuary. Paratia is one of the sub-regional divisions of Arcadia again, which I'll be talking about a little bit more in a moment, because I have a section of them. And David Romano actually stated that no doubt the great Paratian sanctuary suits Lycaeus that eventually became the major cult center of the Arcadian Federation. So he was also that sort of persuasion that it was originally Paratian. But I think generally that's a zone where identity will be more fluid, even if I think it's Paratian in its origin. And it'd be interesting to see how the article gets received. Now, it should also be mentioned, though, when it says Arcadian Federation there, that's a very, very short-lived thing as well. It lasts for less than 10 years. But it was important to the Arcadians long before the Federation, so it became important to the Arcadians probably in the 5th century, rather than 4th century when the Federation was around. Right. As I said, I like to think it was Paratian to begin with. And I will be talking about the possibility of a potentially separate Parisian identity group from the Arcadians, but I'll come back to it in a moment. Again, this is a place where I could talk at length, so I have tried to limit myself a little bit. The first and most important thing, though, when it comes to the Arcadians and their definition of themselves, self-using myth history, is the claim of being a so-called autochthonous group. As I mentioned, sprung from the earth, which is this gentleman here, Pelasgus. You have myths associated with heroes with that name across the Greek world. There's a Pelasgus in Thessaly. There's, yeah, everywhere. Really, there's a Pelasgus somewhere. The Dona is another place. But it makes them a very interesting group, and it's very much sort of emphasizing that in opposition to the other groups in the Peloponnese, such as the Lacedaemonians or Spartans, as well as the Elans, that has more of a Dorian heritage in their stories. Granted, the Elan claim to it quite often comes from Anatolian having guided the Dorians rather than actually Dorians, but still there's a link to the Dorians there. Now, this putative heritage was constructed through mythical genealogies that attached them to him and to Lycaon. And with this, they came to be associated as a pre-migration group in the Peloponnese, possibly as a response, as I said, to the growing influence of Dorianism across the peninsula, because there is major political developments happening in the Archaic period around. Right. So if you look at what we now think of Arcadia in the early Archaic period, it probably, I think, would have looked very different. I have already mentioned the possibility of a separate Parisian group, which became the later sub-regional ethnic group of the Parisians. These are also, as evidence in Thucydides, suggest a micro-federation within the larger region, so it's quite cool. Across the entirety of Arcadia, we see loads of these groups, well, loads, 5 of them. There's the Kynurians, the Thracians, and the Manalians as well. These other ones I mentioned here, the Kynurians, Turians, and Manalians, likely developed later as a response to internal ethnogenesis happening within the region. The other group, so I said 5, so the final one of those is the Asanians, the obscure Asanians, who resided in the northernmost part of the region of Arcadia. Sorry, my paper has gone slightly into the wrong order, so I will do Eastern Arcadia after. Yeah, so Asania is in the northernmost bit there. At least that's what the sources suggest. Again, as I said, they're obscure, so we don't know if there were communities further south as well. It has been argued against and it's been argued for. But it is an interesting group, the Asanians, because they are a group that is obscure, and they're always back projected into this period. And there's a statement in there. Now I'm back here on from Strabo, which states that it seems that the Arcadian ethnic groups, such as both the Asanians and the Parisians and others like this, were the oldest of the Hellenes, specifically highlighting those two, Asanians and Parisians. Of course, Strabo writes much later than this, but it may show a form of a cultural memory that survives of these groups being early groups. Right. Final place. Now, there. So we will talk a little bit more about myths associated with them later. I will now go into the Eastern Arcadian region, which is a very interesting concept to me, because this is where all the big cities are forming early. Tegea, Mantinea, Orchomenus, this is the big cities of Arcadia, and Stymphalus as well is within this area. Right. Now, in the account of Eumelus of Corinth, a early poet from, well, Corinth, which is on the north coast of the Peloponnese, there is 2 heroes mentioned as sons of Arcas. These are Apheidas and Elatus. My interest in them is that Apheidas is associated with Tegea. That's not clean, isn't it? Yeah. Elatus is associated with the mountain up there. Now, the fact that there's only these two here is very interesting because this shows the early genealogical myth of the Arcadians. If you think Eumelus is 6th century writer in at least that's where I work with him, and that's what Martin West suggested in his article on Corinthia as well, which is where this genealogy comes from. Now, so you have the association with them. You also have the thing that Elatus's son again is Stymphalus, so that's at another Arcadian city, which is in the area around Mount Pelion here. So all of this region is sort of covered by it to some extent, which is very interesting. As I said, it fits into the region where several of the big cities developed. Tegea, Mantinea, Orchomenus, Stymphalus. There's also Alea and Kafka is also part of this region. The urbanization process in this one likely kicked off following the foundation of the polis of Tegea as a city-state in the second half of the 6th century, which I think, again, Knut argued quite well for in his talk recently here. Now, so for my purpose here, the importance is this genealogical myth connecting it all, and the spark of urbanization, which is also intriguing because that promotes that local city level of identity instead of that sub-regional Eastern Arcadian level. Now, and it is speculated that the myth of Arcas, in fact, originated within this sub-region, Arcas being the eponymous here of the region. And within a fragment of the account of the, as a rare Arcadian historian, because they are rare, Ariatus of Tegea, Arcas's mother is listed as Megisto, which is rather unique considering in most other stories is Callisto, but in this one is Megisto. And it has been proposed, which is tied to the hero Cythius, and that shows up. It's been speculated that it shows a potential links to Eastern Arcadia for Arcas, and that this is the one of the earliest versions of the myth, and that even to begin with, it wouldn't have included Mount Lycaeum, which, as I said, later becomes the important part of Arcadian religion. Now, the fact that it doesn't include that does show that it's separate from the wider later Arcadian myth. And the earliest account we have of Megisto in this context is Pherecydes of Athens. So again, think late 6th, early 5th sort of period. So it's quite an early story happening here. And again, it's always interesting when you see these people from faraway cities having these tales from obscure mountainous regions like this. Yeah, so you can see definitely sort of a history used there in the poems of creating these two genealogical heroes at the bottom and top of the region. Of course, it is not only foundation myths that is necessary for the development of a sense of a common community identity, ethnic identity, and so on. So I'll just say another example from Eastern Arcadia. That may be cults. And one that's particularly interesting for Eastern Arcadia is that of Athena Alea, not just for the Tegea, but for the whole sort of potential sub-region here. Because Alea likely originated as a separate goddess to Athena, which is very interesting. And then later synthesized with her. And we can see cults of her in other parts of Eastern Arcadia as well, in Mantinea and in Alea as a city-state that's even named after her. And it's even more interesting that at the very sort of outskirts into neighboring regions, we have mentions of Athena Alea in Laconia and Hera Alea in Corinth, or Sicyon, sorry. So it's an interesting sort of on both edges, but as an independent goddess, she's likely belonging to this Eastern Arcadian strip. Interestingly as well, is one of the festivals in Tegea itself is called Alea, showing potentially the veneration of Alea more than the veneration of Athena in his name. There's a local tribe in Mantinea that's named after her, called Apelea, as well as the polis Alea as well, as already mentioned. And it is true that neither Stymphilus nor Commonus, that's a part of this region, has Kosovo, but in between them is the city of Alea as well. So there's an interesting dynamic there because that city is in between these two larger centers. So that may explain that. So this should be enough to at least propose that Alea may have been a significant deity across Eastern Arcadia. Right, and then going back to my favorite obscure people. Now, because the territory inhabited by them is, as I said, uncertain. Our earliest mention of them is actually quite early, despite the fact that quite often people say Herodotus as the earliest one, but they are actually mentioned within the Homeric hymn to Python Apollo, not as a people, but as an Asanian girl who is unfortunate, depending on your definition, to catch the attention of Apollo, one of Elatus's sons. And Elatus, as we've seen, is associated with Eastern Arcadia and Mount Killeen, but so there's a connection between them there. But this interesting story that the Asanian girl is actually mentioned in the Homeric hymn is quite interesting to me. And that I think is the earliest one. And I know there's debates about the date of this poem as well, but I again work with this as a 6th century poem. Following this, they are very infrequently mentioned, even though they mention some really cool things that I'm not going to talk about today. But they're mentioned in the Homeric hymn as well as other later texts. Is enough to suggest that the group did actually exist. There has been a lot of back and forward on them as well because they are as obscure as they are. But at least their cultural memory survives into the classical period, although they did never bound together to political federation. As I said, the federation became a micro-federation. Even the Arcadians as a whole had a brief period as a regional federation. But the Asanians, as far as we can tell, never bound together in any political thing. I think it is because one of their biggest city was slightly aggressive in the Archaic period. Which is just my theory on it. But yeah. But on the famous Arcadian monument at Delphi, which is, funny enough, placed right in front of the Spartan monument, which is a fun political statement to do for anyone. And also in Pausanias, we have the mention of a new son of Alcas that doesn't appear in the early stuff, which is Asan, or an eponym, potential eponym for the Asanians, which again is a very intriguing development because that shows that at that point they have been recognized as a full sort of group that is incorporated into this genealogical system. But furthermore, one of the two main versions of Arcas' myth, or his mother's myth, really, Callisto. So back to Callisto, no more Megisto now. Is taking place at the outskirts of this region at Mount Killeen. And in this version, there's a few different versions of this myth as well, because that's why the Greek myth is so fascinating, because there's so many different versions. But according to the version I set up there, now Artemis killed Callisto not long after Callisto had met and had her encounter with Zeus, leading the thunder gods to actually come down, say the fetus, and entrust it to Hermes, who then again entrusted to his mother Maya, who resides among Killeen on the outskirts of Asania and the outskirts of Eastern Arcadia. So the interesting part of that for today's purpose is then the myth of Callisto, and this myth and the link to Asan as a son of Arcas may indicate a form of a ideological way of connecting the two groups with each other through changing narratives of the mythical past. Now, I think that I find really interesting because I'm now moving on to the Paratians, the third group. But in his doctoral thesis, Kyle Mahoney referred to rival traditions within the region happening in Arcadia. As similar mythical developments also happened in the southwest towards Paratia, which is sort of area down here. Tegea plain here, and then Paratia is this area with much Lycaon and stuff over there. I already briefly mentioned them. And this, as I said, where Mantlekane was, but also where the other major myth of Callisto is associated. And in this story, Callisto managed to escape the wrath of Hera, who was found out about her encounter with Zeus. But she lives her life out as a bear. Now, unfortunately, many years later, Arcas, having grown up after being saved by sheepherds, find himself hunting a bear that also happens to be his mother, unknowingly, not knowing that this is his mother. And he chases her into a sacred enclosure of Mount Lycaeum, so into Zeus's sacred mountain. So then you have that association to the Paratian temple there, Paratian sanctuary. And it firmly places the story of Arcas in the Paratian region rather than Cyllene or Mankyline or Tegea, which is further emphasized by some later sources, such as Ovid, referring to Callisto as a Paratian rather than an Arcadian, which is an interesting one as well. Even again, Ovid is late, but it may show a cultural memory that has survived. Another example of such history used within Paratia is a very, very intriguing genealogy that makes Arcas a twin of the quintessential Arcadian god Pan. So I already mentioned Aleia and Zeus Lycaon, but Pan is the other sort of a really big god in Arcadia. He's one of the most important gods for this region. And in this one, he's a twin of the regional eponymous hero, which survives in a fragment in the work of Aeschylus. There's two gods named Pan in this fragment. Sometimes there's also even more in other versions, but in this particular one, there's two. One who's a brother of Zeus, and another one the twin of Arcas. So you get that sort of interesting comparison of Arcas and Zeus and Pan, sort of one being the more civilizing city builder kind of creature, whereas the other one is the wild Arcadia in many ways, and the herds and everything nature related, which is an interesting sort of comparison with them. Now, so then all of a sudden you have the two different versions there, one that ties Pan to Arcas, and you have then the potential of a conflation of Paratian and Arcadian versions of the stories of Pan, which is really interesting because there's a temple at Mount Lycaeum for Pan that has very unique dedications for Pan. I think at Periclea, which is again a very cool thing about this. And again, this story can also be shown to be quite early. The first time we have Pan attested as a twin of Arcas is in the work of Epimenides of Crete. So then, again, very debated date, but no later than the mid-5th century, I would say. So you have that from a very early time as well. So these examples shows. That should be all right. This example shows some uses of the past and stories that's preserved in the group's cultural memory that reflects the shaping of identities within Arcadia and within groups and individuals within Arcadia, possibly affecting the unification of the region into the larger region we now know. But what could potentially have sparked this? Well, first of all, there's the rising power of Sparta. In the 7th century, Sparta puts under them the region of Messene, which is a massive region here, but Sparta controls most of this southern tip of the peninsula for quite a while. And Messene is sort of the one to take in the 7th century. But the easiest way to get from Sparta to Messene is actually through Paratia and Arcadia. So that might have sparked sort of an idea of trying to unify the group in East Arcadia with Paratia in the south, because you have that rise of Sparta there that would have to cross through these territories to make it into the now occupied region. So they would have contributed the need for a shared identity and a shared sort of common goals in the south. Now, but Sparta was not the only expanding power in the Peloponnese at this point. You have in the corner up here, Elis, which consolidated the region also named Elis in this period into their power. And as Maria Presley mentioned in an article from 2018, there is evidence of relations between the Spartans and the Elamans at this point. So if you're sitting in any part of the Arcadian mountains and you see these two groups consolidating and expanding power, well, you would be slightly nervous, wouldn't you? So then started to merge with other mountainous group would kind of make sense. In particular, because you have in the Argolid over here, you have Argos starting to consolidate things as well. They didn't really get control of the Argyle plane until 460, but they are starting to do that project. So you have all of these major political things happening, and rewriting your past mythical stories is a good way of then finding common ground for these groups in the inland. And then I will briefly touch upon Tegea. I swear I won't be talking forever. But I felt if I'm going to have a talk here, this was a necessary bit. This is not a region as the other ones, but it's a city. It's a very fascinating city. And the Norwegian Institute has been very involved in leading excavations around the temple here and various parts of the city. And I will talk a little bit about what I call in my thesis, the Golden Age of Tegea. For Golden Age, I'm following the definition set out by historical sociologist Anthony Smith that refers to stories on how we became great and heroic. Could be very far in the past, could be very recent, but that is basically the Golden Age. That's the time when we were good. And for that reason, the 5th century is particularly interesting, as Arcadia was a region with a strong regional identity, as I already mentioned. However, it remained a region where the polis and the sub-regional groups remained strong, and that more local identities were more important than the larger regional. Now, Tegea is one of the cities that try to sort of overrun those local identities and become a hegemon of a larger part of Arcadia in the 5th century. And you have interesting stories appearing in Herodotus that might be related to this. First of all, they are to thank for the historians being 3 generations late to the Peloponnese after a single combat between Echimus and Heracles' son Hyllus, where Echimus won. This is a stele you find in the Archaeological Museum in Tegea, and that is actually quite an interesting piece of history use because this is a stele where they put on his name, and it's one of my favorite artifacts from that museum. And it shows that sort of history of using that to claim the past. So eventually, this also took place at the time when the Peloponnese was consolidated under one king. So they were the defenders of the Peloponnese in many ways in that. So it's an interesting mythical tale showing sort of ideological and political aspects of using the past. Herodotus also credits it again with having convinced the Spartans of returning north of the isthmus after the Battle of Thermopylae. His name was Chileus of Tegea. The question can also be, would he really have that influence with the Spartans? Or is this a Tegean variety where their man is getting a bigger role than he would necessarily have had? He may have been influential, but he may not have been the only one speaking to the Spartans about going back north. So it is another potential sort of overblown account of a Tegean strong position in the 5th century. And the final one I will mention is the bones of Orestes, which makes perfect sense from a Spartan perspective. Basically, Sparta goes to Delphi, having tried to conquer Arcadia, and being told that, no, settle with Tegea, because they will find the bones of Orestes, which they can use to then claim a stronger position, because he was once the king of the Peloponnese, and he can be seen as an Achaean descendant of Agamemnon and have that lineage. Eventually, the Spartans did defeat the Tegeans in this war and brought back the bones. Well, from the Spartans' perspective, this story makes sense to claim that, but not from a Tegean perspective. From a Tegean perspective, this makes more sense in that 5th century period, where they then become sort of a defenders of Arcadia again against Spartan aggressors, because that's who has to be defeated to defeat Arcadia, or the first sort of line to fall would be them. So it's an interesting sort of thing that the Tegeans might have played on again in the 5th century during that brief hegemonic alliance. I'm not the first one to argue that this story belongs in the 5th century, and again, Maria Pretzler is also arguing for this, for instance. So stories such as Echimus, Chileus, and the bones of Oris can be seen as the Tegean portraying themselves in a particularly strong and good way. And through that, using local myth history reflected, use local myth history as well as a relatively recent leader in Chileus, allowing them to create a golden age based on it. So you see various ways of using history there. Even though in this case it is within the same century, but you still see a way of using it in a recent way then. And yeah, I showed you some examples from Buisha, some from Arcadia, some more locally from Tegea. And with that, I'm gonna stop before I speak too long.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas, for this really deep dive into complexity of the ancient city formation. Any questions, any comments?
I think you were a very interesting talk. I'm not so familiarized with the history review.
Yeah.
Actually, it's not really my field. Anyway.
Okay.
So, but it's super interesting. I was wondering if you look at the culture, if you can trace a myth into a culture, is it possible to use history book as a way to see changes in the internal culture, such as becoming more industrialized? Yeah, how far do you think you can take the history book in terms of research in local cultures or even network modeling?
It will depend on where you go. So if you go somewhere like Thebes,
yeah,
you could possibly do a fair bit with it. Because that's a city that we have relatively well documented. Same with the region of Buisha in general. You could do something with this wood group there, and that's one of the things I want to do in long terms. I'll look at a much larger versions as well, because across the Greek world you have regions who construct these myths back to Thessaly. So I want to do eventually a project that sort of looks historically in the grand scheme of Greek things. What I would really like though is to be able to do it in somewhere like Aetolia or Arcadia. But then we started to talk on regions where the sources let you form a little bit of a picture, but not enough really. So it varies a lot with where you are. It may be possible in Athens actually. If anyone, huh? Corinth, to some extent, yeah. But Corinth is another one of these cities that was a big player for quite a while, but isn't really mentioned enough to make a big thing out of the history use in terms of them. And part of the reason is that with Eumelos of Corinth is fragmented, which is unfortunate because we would have an actual Corinthian version of it all. The fragments we have is actually really cool, just saying that. So that would have been interesting there. And I'd be also really interested if we could find the evidence to see how we could do this with their colonies, because up in northwest Greece and so on, it would be a fascinating thing to do. But there is, because they're not Athens or Sparta for that matter, they fall slightly outside of the category that many, especially the historiography, focuses on often. But you can form a picture, I think, of Corinth at least. Yeah.
Very interesting insight. I wanted to ask about sources.
Yeah.
You mentioned ancient authors and photographers and so on, and less archaeological finds. How do archaeological finds play into your research?
So, well, yeah, for this talk, I decided to just focus on the literature, but I've always been sort of very driven to get the archaeology involved as well. And I think things such as monumental architecture could be one way of looking at this and how it is represented in iconography, as well as inscriptions that has genealogies on them could be a interesting one. So there's definitely ways archaeology could play a big part of this sort of research. And I'm trying to say that my background is entirely as a historian, so my archaeological knowledge is not as good as I want it to be, but I'm working on building that up so I can learn more about how this can figure in.
Places where there's sources, the sources are.
Yeah.
Okay. Here
Uh,
we have one, the archaeological record.
Yeah.
Archaeological find what
Yeah. Yeah, think in those cases, the archaeology is the best way to go because that is what we have. I think in the Atolia that might actually be more useful because there's, again, they've really infrequently mentioned in sources up until the Hellenistic period, but makes sense. They get a very big player at that point. But somewhere like Thermon and the inscriptions there, to sit down and look at it, they might give sort of a similar overview where you can do this, or in Caledon, with a similar sort of thing, as the two sort of major sanctuaries within that. So I do definitely think the archaeology could be very useful for this. I just need to develop myself as an archaeologist a little bit more first, so I can treat it with the due diligence it actually needs. Yeah.
There are no more comments or questions. We could continue our discussion with a glass of wine or a snack. Thank you all for being with us. It was I guess this thesis that you presented, sort of part of it, we should kind of read through it because for most of the, of the non-experts in the field, it's really another world to grasp in terms of, sources, names, and myths that we are already kind of familiar with. So it's a nice topic maybe to take on in your course and to discuss a little bit this the methodological use of history in looking at mythology and of course archaeology. That was again a very good point in terms of using the past in general, different disciplines, different fields. And we had a discussion with Thomas in the afternoon about historians and archaeologists and still the disputes and the arguments, but not in a very nice way. Thomas was describing sometimes how to understand each other. I mean, those two fields, the different fields should be able to exchange views on those topics. So that might be an interdisciplinary point that you bring about. I'm not sure what Paschalis would like to say something about that, or okay, so thank you so much for being here, and see you in the other room for